My name is Lorna. I want to thank you for inviting me to speak today on behalf of Refugee Voices Tours, and also thank you for sitting in a really hot room and listening to very important issues. We're an organization of refugee activists giving walking tours in Berlin and Copenhagen. Our guides use the history of the cities that they are in to draw parallels that explain the situations in their countries and why they were forced to flee. Here in Berlin, our team are Syrian activists, and the tour is called Why We're Here. Today we are talking about migration, and the question is how? How can people safely cross the Mediterranean? How can people find a safer and better life in Europe? How can nations across the continent cooperate to achieve this? But our organization concentrates on the question, why? Why are people being forced to flee? The problem lies at the heart of the crisis in the country in question. The passage across the Mediterranean is a symptom of this, not the cause, and we need transnational cooperation to solve these problems. Migration is a fundamental topic which must be discussed, but I want to begin today by saying that we must not lose sight of the why. By concentrating only on the how, we could too easily forget those who are still suffering conflict and persecution in Syria and other countries from which people are fleeing. As our organization uses European history to highlight current global issues, I want to begin today by taking you back to Hamburg in 1939. After the first state-sponsored pogrom against Jewish people in Germany in 1938, and the beginning of the arrests of Jewish people in Nazi Germany, many people felt they had no choice but to flee. A ship called the MS St. Louis set sail from Hamburg to Cuba, carrying 937 passengers, most of them Jewish refugees, who were sailing to Cuba in the hopes of a better, safer life. The captain, a non-Jewish German man, insisted that the Jewish passengers were treated well, and he covered the mandatory bust of Hitler on board with a tablecloth, a bold and dangerous move at the time. When the ship arrived into Cuba, all the passengers but 29 were refused entry, despite the fact that they all had entry permits. After 5 days in the harbor in Cuba and tough negotiating, Captain Schröder took the decision to sail to America in the hopes of the passengers being able to disembark. Under Roosevelt's orders, the ship was turned away. Next, the captain tried Canada, where the refugees were met once again with hostility and turned back. After 34 days at sea, Captain Schröder finally docked at the harbor in Antwerp, Belgium, refusing to take the passengers back to Germany. France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and the UK all decided to take around 200 refugees each, and finally their long voyage was over. But of course, soon enough, Nazi Germany would invade much of Europe, and the refugees who had tried so hard to flee found themselves back in the very same nightmare from which they had started. It is estimated that 250 of the passengers from the MS St. Louis were murdered during the Holocaust. Those 250 lives could have been saved if they had not been met with closed borders in countries far away from the Nazis. I tell you this story because as I stand here today, there are at least 350 refugees stranded on at least 2 boats in the Mediterranean Sea. They have been turned away from Italy and Malta because of strict immigration policies. Unable to dock, and unable to get an immediate reaction from European nations, the fate of these passengers, some of whom are heavily pregnant, is uncertain. The Italian government is even paying the Libyan Coast Guard to push boats back to Libyan shores, where many refugees on board are taken to detention camps and prisons and often treated like slaves. The treatment of those refugees is no secret. There are many reports that they, especially Black Africans, are in grave danger of being starved, tortured, and sold into slavery in Libya. It begs the question, How do we as humans forget our past mistakes so quickly? Those who refuse entry to the passengers of the MS St. Louis are tainted by its legacy. We build memorials to those who were murdered under National Socialism in order to make sure that we do not repeat this dark chapter of human history. And it makes me think of what a Syrian activist and dear friend of mine once said. Do not watch us die and then light a candle and to show your sadness when we have gone and say never again. That is why transnational cooperation, both regarding the current situation in the Mediterranean and the conflict in Syria, is such a pressing issue. I believe that history can teach us a lot. In Europe today, we need to remember that those figures in history who refuse to act to protect the lives of innocent people will find it hard to shake that dark legacy. Those who have protected and saved human lives, like Captain Schröder, will be remembered for their contribution to humanity. I want to tell you now some figures, some statistics, and Julia obviously covered this earlier, that these statistics are very difficult to know, and this is probably an underestimate. But I want you just to think about the numbers, and I want you to think about what that means for humanity. 400,000, the number of Syrians killed in Syria since 2011. 6 million, the number of Syrians displaced within Syria since 2011. 5.6 million, the number of Syrians displaced outside of Syria since 2011. 15,000, an estimate of the number of refugees who have drowned in the Mediterranean Sea in the last 5 years. Around 1,000, the number of refugees who have drowned in the Mediterranean Sea so far this year. 15,000, the number of refugees stranded in camps on Greek islands. 70,000 unaccompanied children who have entered the European Union as refugees in the past 3 years. Over 10,000 unaccompanied refugee children have gone missing in the European Union in the past 3 years. These numbers are staggering and show clearly that the international community has failed to cooperate in order to deal effectively with migration, especially migration through the Mediterranean and into the European Union. With these numbers in mind, it seems slightly arbitrary for us to be here today, talking with one another about a topic that we, as an audience, largely agree on. The statistics are terrifying, and these numbers are only increasing. I first met people living in Germany as refugees in 2012 and spoke with them about their treacherous journeys to Italy through the Mediterranean. I was truly shocked then and believed that the situation couldn't get any worse. Every year since then, I have found myself losing hope for a solution to the worst man-made humanitarian disaster of the 21st century. For the past year or so, I have not spoken publicly about the situation because I feel that I am often standing before an audience like this one, like-minded individuals who want something to change for the better. I felt that my words meant very little as the death toll increased and the crisis deepened, and I simply stopped being able to talk about it. But when I was asked to speak here, it seemed that both me and the Refugee Voices team in Berlin had a lot to say about this topic. In fact, we spent an afternoon sitting in a cafe ranting about the topic with frustration. I will break our discussion down into 2 parts. First, I will cover the challenges facing transnational cooperation, and then the possible solutions to this crisis. The challenges are many, and I will only mention a few of the most important here today. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, for most Syrians living as refugees, the challenge is not migration, but rather the conflict in Syria itself. The biggest challenge facing many who have been forced to flee their countries is that they wish to return home to a safe, free, and peaceful country. This also requires transnational cooperation. In the case of Syria, many of the world's most powerful countries are funding militias, supporting military campaigns, or propping up a brutal dictator. The challenge is getting these countries to stop fanning the flames of the conflict and actually find real, long-term solutions in Syria. You cannot sell weapons with one hand and with the other hand push away people who are fleeing from the bullets. Speaking frankly, if there is one thing many Syrians and members of far-right parties can agree on, it's that they wish for Syrians to go back home. This can only happen if world leaders put efforts into solving the roots of the problem rather than profiting from them. This goes not only for Syria, but for many countries in conflict. And if real solutions are found and stability is restored, migration through the Mediterranean will undoubtedly decrease. That being said, with climate change destroying livelihoods, this migration will not stop altogether, and Europe needs to wake up in order to deal with the next crisis, which is undoubtedly just around the corner. This brings me to one of the most fundamental and dangerous challenges regarding migration through the Mediterranean: the rise of the far-right and anti-immigrant ideologies in Europe. I will highlight how dangerous these ideologies are by stating that last week, politicians within the European Union condemned the efforts of independent rescue ships in the Mediterranean. Condemnation for the people saving lives. That's when you know something is not quite right. Leaders within the EU stood by Italy's decision to close their ports and stated that they will be increasing efforts to help the Libyan Coast Guard take people back to Libya. Politicians in Europe are afraid after people's reaction to Angela Merkel accepting a large number of refugees in 2015. Many politicians see it as her downfall, her demise, and they want to pander to a xenophobic voting base rather than risk losing votes by helping people find a safe passage to Europe. Just a few weeks ago, Angela Merkel stated that the future of the EU rests on finding answers to the vital questions posed by migration, but not many people seem willing to cooperate. The rise of anti-immigrant far-right ideologies threatens the very foundation on which Europe was built after the fall of the Iron Curtain. Not only are we talking about the deaths or persecutions of those seeking refuge in Europe, we are in fact talking about the end of Europe as a peaceful, largely united continent, the end of democracy and the end of transnational cooperation as we know it. Let us not forget that the last time Europe was challenged with such ideologies, there was a devastating war, and we as Europeans became displaced people, refugees, hoping to find safe passage and an open border, and sometimes finding it in countries like Syria and Egypt. How we deal with this challenge lies with politicians. How, when, or if they will wake up to the current rhetoric is still uncertain. The next challenge lies with those who have made the dangerous journey and have resettled in Europe. A key question, as has been discussed quite a lot today, regarding migration is, how do we get people to integrate? Many people come expecting to find a free land of plenty, but often the reality is quite the opposite. I do not have to go into the details of the appalling conditions in which people are living in detention camps in Greece. It is common knowledge. How can we expect people living in such conditions to integrate when their children are often denied education and basic necessities like clean water and nutritious food are scarce? And then there's another side of it, which brings me to Germany, a country often seen as having a welcoming culture, a success story. And yet, as has been discussed, life is not easy for those who have arrived here as refugees. These days, many people are given just a 1-year residency permit, making it hard for them to rent a property, whether they're in Berlin or not, and taking away motivation to integrate, because after all, who would spend energy learning German when in a year's time it may all have been for nothing? A Syrian friend of mine, my Arabic teacher, who was also a teacher in Syria, worked hard to learn German and passed the necessary language exams required to start training as a kindergarten teacher, whilst raising 3 children. After this hard work, she was told that because she only had 1 year left on her residency permit, the job centre would not subsidize her course. She was dumbfounded. She said to me, "What does Germany want? I want to contribute to society here, but it seems they don't want me to. Should I just sleep for a year and then see what happens?" The word integration is thrown around, but when it comes to actually helping people feel integrated and part of society, the doors to opportunity often remain closed. On top of this, as has been discussed before, many people took a dangerous journey through the Mediterranean alone, hoping to then be able to bring their families through a safe journey to Europe. But with family reunification slowing or altogether stopping in the European Union, people end up living without their spouses or children. We cannot expect people to integrate without feeling at home, and people often struggle to feel at home when their family is not with them. The challenges are huge and daunting, but I don't just want to concentrate on them. I also want to show concrete examples of solutions. I will first mention with great admiration, the people operating rescue ships in the Mediterranean, independent ships often crowd-funded and run by a volunteer crew, including medical staff. The crews are often multinational, a true show of transnational cooperation and an example of how life-saving missions in the Mediterranean are possible if European leaders are willing to change their attitudes and begin to provide safety to those fleeing to our shores. Berlin is also an example of how solutions can be found, as has been discussed. Though I have spoken of the difficulties for people living in Germany as refugees, it is also important to acknowledge the numerous grassroots organizations, and has been discussed also state organizations in Berlin, which have created opportunities, safe spaces, and community for many people. For me, seeing the change between how many people were engaged in helping refugees in 2012 and how many people are now engaged gives me a small sense of hope and a strong sense of pride in the human compassion that many Berliners have shown since the crisis began. But I do want to emphasize that many of these organizations are independent and they are not sponsored by the state. Another incredible initiative is the self-organized refugee camp Pitka on the island of Lesbos. This camp was built from the ground up by international volunteers, and it is a safe, clean space where refugees can receive medical care, psychological support, and education. In stark contrast to the EU-funded refugee camps on Lesbos, Pitka offers refugees the chance to feel welcomed and safe and provides them with tools to develop and learn whilst they are waiting for their fate to be decided, which can take years. Just a few weeks ago, it was announced that Pitka will be forcefully closed by authorities due to alleged unsanitary conditions, although it is well known that the EU-funded camp Moria has far worse conditions. The overcrowding there has led to tensions and eventually violence within the camp. Does it make sense to close the independent camp when the EU-funded camps are already at breaking point? It is not hard to see that this is yet another EU policy of deterring people from making the treacherous journey to Europe. Those fleeing war, persecution, or poverty are now often left with two choices: stay in your own country and suffer or even die, or cross the Mediterranean on a dangerous journey and then spend years being treated as subhuman in refugee camps. These examples of solutions to the current crisis are interesting because they highlight how transnational cooperation can make these humanitarian efforts possible. But the governments in Europe are often not aiding or engaged with these organizations. They are even, as mentioned before, condemning their efforts. Where governments have often failed, ordinary citizens have tried to fill the gaps, and in doing so have saved the lives of thousands and given the refugees the feeling that they are welcomed by at least some European citizens. It is a case where citizens are setting the precedent in dealing with a humanitarian disaster, whilst governments are refusing to face up to the challenge they are being presented with. In terms of Syria, I do not believe or expect many Syrians to ever forgive European countries. First, in failing to intervene when the Syrian regime used violence and eventually chemical weapons against peaceful protesters, transnational cooperation failed Syria from the very beginning of the revolution. European governments failed again when those who saw no choice as fighting intensified in Syria but to flee their country and head to Europe on dangerous journeys with no safe corridors to reach their destinations. It is fair to say that the European Union has the blood of thousands of Syrians on its hands, those who have drowned both in the Mediterranean and Aegean seas. And finally, Europe has failed to build a sufficient infrastructure in order to help these people find a better life in Europe, often hindering them from ever successfully integrating into European societies. But I want to conclude this talk today by mentioning the most vulnerable refugees of all, the children, and especially those children who have come to Europe without parents or guardians. There are tens of thousands of children growing up in Europe in squalid conditions with no access to education. And even more frightening, as I mentioned at the beginning of this speech, there are over 10,000 refugee children in Europe who are unaccounted for. Testimonies tell us many of these children are victims of human trafficking, gang crime, and child prostitution. By the time these children become young adults, they will have lived in Europe for longer than they have ever lived in their native countries. Yet many will still struggle to speak the language of the country in which they are living, due to the lack of education. Many will have never learned to read or write, and will therefore be denied the same opportunities in life as their European peers. When young people are not empowered or educated, they often lack self-worth, and without the right tools to show them how to succeed in life, they sometimes turn to prostitution or drug dealing in order to survive. Even in Berlin, this has already become an issue, with young men selling themselves in the Tiergarten and young people dealing drugs at Turmstrasse. These problems will only get bigger if this issue is not tackled head-on. When young people feel not only disenfranchised by society, but also angry at society, they often turn against society. Anti-refugee ideologies and policies stem from fear. And in Europe, this fear stems from recent terrorist attacks, often carried out by young people who felt unwelcome in society and who were targeted and groomed by groups like ISIS who encouraged them to create chaos. This gave these young people not only a sense of belonging and purpose, but also a way out of their seemingly hopeless futures. It is imperative that Europeans from across the political spectrum understand that children, no matter where they are from, must have the right to a safe and clean place to live and access to education. Perhaps we cannot force politicians to immediately change the current policy in the Mediterranean, but we can help people to understand that there is a generation of refugee children growing up on the edge of European society. Unless they are nurtured and educated here, the problems we are seeing today will pale in comparison to what Europe is about to face. Europe is creating its own crisis simply by refusing to cooperate for the sake of human rights. An agreement must be reached on how to improve education and well-being for refugee children, not just for the future of these children, but for the future of a unified and tolerant Europe.
Thank you so much for your talk. I do have a very specific question on your work tours that you're doing.
Yeah.
You haven't said too much about those. So like they're happening in Berlin and Copenhagen.
Yeah,
How
so
do you organize yourself? So like how did you get the refugees?
okay, so I'd talk a little bit about myself. So I kind of accidentally became involved in this topic. In 2012, I was living near a space called Oranienplatz, which was occupied by refugees fighting for their rights. In Europe, this was back before Germany had a welcoming culture and people were really kept in detention camps and they were not able to get education. So a lot of people marched to Berlin, they occupied Oranienplatz, and they stayed there for 2 years, both on Oranienplatz and an occupied abandoned school, the Gerhard Hauptmann Schule. Yeah. And I was new in Berlin when this happened, so these people just became my friends that I met. This was my community in Berlin. And then in 2014, these spaces were largely evicted. And then 2015, the media attention very quickly changed to talking about Syrian refugees. And this whole story of the occupation was really forgotten. And I said to my friends, because I'm a tour guide, I should mention that, I said to my friends, you know, this would make a really good tour. You could actually talk about this whole movement during a walking tour. So we made a Facebook event, and it went viral, basically. So we didn't do any marketing or anything. We're just like friends having an idea. And yeah, we were very quickly in The Guardian, The New Yorker, lots of press. And then some Syrian friends came on the tour, and they said, we want to do this, but we want to do it about Syria. And so that's when we just started to have this idea, how can we make a tour in Berlin about Syria? And actually, there's quite a lot of parallels to be drawn between Syrian history, the current situation in Syria and Berlin history. Through revolution and war, dictatorship. So this was our idea, and we've been doing this tour since 2015 as well. And it's called Why We're Here, as I said. The one that's about the Gerhard Hauptmann Schule and Oranienplatz is no longer running because many of these people were deported, and some of them who weren't deported are now in education, so they don't have time. But if anybody is interested in taking the tour, it happens every Saturday at 3 p.m. And you will find all the details either on our website, which is refugeevoicestours.org, or on our Facebook page, which is Refugee Voices Tours Berlin. And in case any of you go to Copenhagen, we already set it up there as well a couple of years ago. Similar idea, but that we have a Kurdish man from the Kurdish part of Iraq and an Eritrean woman, so very different stories being told in Copenhagen. Yeah.
I was the spokesperson for the district when the school was evicted at that time.
You were?
Yeah.
I thought I recognized you.
And we still house the people there from the school. We paid for it.
Well, some of them, let's be honest.
Them, yes.
A lot of them, well, most of them were evicted.
Some
And
of them, yes, we still do.
yeah, it's still a bone of contention, let's say.
Yeah.
It's a debate for another
They
day.
don't have any contact with their lawyers anymore because they don't get paid anymore, so they talk to us. Funny, huh?
Yeah, I mean, this story is a long story, and I think that there were mistakes made on both sides, but I think you could also agree with that.
Yes, definitely.
So thank you very much.